Brigade. 6th. So now what? We go on a historical fishing expedition, said Hennie Nel as their aircar landed on outskirts of the great sprawling naval complex on the west side of the Puget Sound. That was the Kriegsmarine's Bremerton Naval Station. Yes, although I'm not exactly sure what fish we ought to be baiting our hook for, replied Redmond thoughtfully. God, this has the makings of an unholy mess. Let's discover the truth first if we can, Sarge. Then once we have it, we can sit back and figure out just what the hell to do with it. Our next step is to interview the 8 known survivors of the Olympic flying column. This is going to be a sensitive process, Nell. Our goal has to be to find out why each one of them survived. In other words, why the hell were all 8 of these people somewhere else so didn't ride into the ambush at Ravenhill Ranch with the rest of the column? My first question would be why the 2 men in the green bakkie that was being used as the column scout car survived, ruminated Nell. I don't entirely buy MC Bride's explanation that they were let go on federal SOP. If Fatty was out for the reward, why not? H. Covington. The reward for 2 more of U.S. terrorists? And how did they know that Murdoch himself or Melanie Young weren't in the scout vehicle? Redmond winced. As it happens, Sarge, I know a little bit about that aspect, he said quietly. Bill Vitale was one of the men in the scout vehicle. He is an old friend of our family, and he talked about that with me. He and volunteer Lars Frierson heard the shooting that came from behind them, and they realized that they had been let slide and the main force had been ambushed. They turned their vehicle around, went back a ways, debussed and approached on foot. They ran into a Fatpo outpost and killed 2 of them. They realized from the sound that there were hundreds of Federals between them and the column, and that they could never make it through alive and rejoin Murdoch. They then followed General Order Number 8 and performed E&E to their respective hideouts. General Order Number 8? asked Nell. Redmond smiled. Otherwise known as the Swamp Fox Order, as in he who fights and runs away lives to fight another day. Unofficially known as Feats Don't Fail Me Now. Even more unofficially known as the Don't Be a Dead Hero, you dumbass. Directive. The old man knew that the life of every volunteer was worth more than 100 dead feds, and the purpose of that general order was to make sure that our most precious resource was not sacrificed needlessly. Some American and Jewish propagandists called us cowards then, and still do, because of that order. That's crap, sir, said Nell with a scowl. The objective of the soldier is to win wars, not conveniently hurl themselves to destruction on an enemy sword, and cowards don't revolt in arms against a tyrant to begin with. I know. I like old George Patton's version, responded Redmond with a chuckle. No one ever won a war by dying for his country. You win it by making the other bastard die for his country. Oh, I don't deny we had a few who really showed yellow and used that order as an excuse for genuine cowardice. We always spotted that, and they didn't last. But I know a lot of vets who followed that order in the spirit it was meant to be followed, and who never forgave themselves for it. Bill Vitale is one of them. What technique should we use in interviewing these survivors, sir? asked Nell, tactfully changing the subject. Nothing fancy, replied Redmond. A little deceptive candor might go a long way for us here. It will be hard for us to make up any plausible explanation as to why we are exhuming old bones, especially old bones as hallowed as those of the Olympic flying column. I think the best approach would be to simply tell these people the truth, that we've received a communication we believe to be from Trudy Greiner, and that she is coming home. Be interesting to see how they react to the news. And also, we need to see if we can find out just how each of them got into the NVA in the first place, how they became racial nationalists, or national socialists, or whatever their particular worldview is. Back in the old days, when you joined the party, you had to sit down and compose a minimum 10,000-word essay on just that subject, giving as much detail as possible. The reasoning behind that requirement was that no one could tell a lie that long and complicated without saying something that would trip him up. Which one of the 8 survivors of the column do we speak with first, Colonel? asked Nell, looking over the files on Redmond's desk. You mentioned Admiral David Leach. I know, but why him? I think we should start with the one who poses the most potential danger to the safety of the Republic if it turns out he's a long-dormant traitor, said Redmond. Wouldn't that be Dr. Cord? queried Nell. He is, after all, the de facto head of the Republic's space program. Maybe. Although if Cord is a long-term Zog spy intent on sabotaging our space program, he doesn't seem to be doing a very good job of it. We are the only nation on Earth who even has a real space program thanks to him. No one else is even on the moon permanently, never mind Mars. My vote for that sinister distinction of most potentially dangerous if disloyal would be Leach of the Kriegsmarine, also known as Bloody Dave from his guerrilla days with the NVA. That name rings a bell, and not just for being an admiral, said Nel thoughtfully. It should, said Redmond grimly. David Leach is the hero of the Spokane incident in Wellington, New Zealand. He faced down an entire country with one battle cruiser and got our sailor boys back out of the local Hoosgow.
That might have been a little before your time, H. Covington, when you were still in South Africa.
Leach damn near started a war, with the United Nations jumping up and down and going booga 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 all over the place, but Leach got his men back, and he demonstrated for all the world to see that you don't fuck with the Northwest Republic. That was my last year in the Special Service before I transferred to Boss. Thanks to Leach's nautical brinkmanship, I spent a wonderful 2 weeks in the snow out on the Montana border, looking down the barrels of our. At 8,000 Chinese regulars and a good 30,000 more or less American troops across the line, wondering when they'd get the order to attack. How many were you, sir? One division, about 4,500 men, so we had them outnumbered, replied Redmond. Turned out that once again Doc Cord's plasma beam weapons saved the day. The Americans couldn't bomb our positions without losing 80% of their aircraft and their pilots in the first wave, and when push came to shove, they didn't dare meet us face to face. Since Vietnam, they've never dared to meet anyone face to face, man to man on the ground. Without their air cover, we would have butchered them, and they knew it. You might say the Spokane affair was the Northwest Republic's true entrance onto the international stage. The reason I consider Admiral Leach the most politically sensitive of the survivors is that Bill Vitale is a field commander, but Leach sits on the general staff, and he's privy to the Republic's most top-secret defense intelligence. He is also in charge of creating a new series of warships for the Kriegsmarine, one that will give our country a global reach, some kind of super battleship or carrier. If we can get these things afloat, it may eventually mean one day we can start recovering countries like South Africa and Rhodesia and Australia for our people. If one of the Olympic flying column survivors is bent, then David Leach is in the position to do the most damage.
How did the Admiral acquire the name of Bloody Dave? Asked Nel. After Ravenhill, Leach went a bit nuts, or maybe he was nuts all along and Ravenhill just sparked it off. Leach disobeyed orders and unilaterally selected his own next assignment. He went east on his own to join that maniac O.C. Ogilvy's crew in Idaho, recounted. The Hill of the Ravens, Redmond.
Nothing succeeds like success, and so the party overlooked his insubordination. Later on, Leach was a commandant himself, during the last year of the war, leader of the Ellensburg flying column. I think they gave it to him as part of a quiet effort to break up Ogilvy's gang prior to independence and make sure we didn't have any Ernst Röhm kind of incidents. The commandants of each mobile partisan unit operated with complete tactical freedom and independence of action. Leach was one of our best, and I have to say probably our cruelest after Ogilvy himself. To be fair, we were fighting the cruelest of foes, an enemy who was trying to destroy our entire race. Leach returned the favor, with interest. He literally ran the Americans out of his sector by brute force. Toward the end, Fat Poe and even the U.S. Marines refused direct orders to go into the Ellensburg district. They were so afraid of Bloody Davy Leach. He also ran out or slaughtered every single individual of any race who couldn't show blood in the face. Blood in the face? So Leach is Christian identity? Asked Nel. No, he's a National Socialist, replied Redmond with pride and satisfaction. It's hard to believe now, when our whole structure of society is based on the Third Reich, and when Army officers and SS applicants have to pass courses in National Socialist ideology. But there was a long and disgraceful period after Commander Rockwell's murder when the American National Socialist movement descended into pure slapstick comedy. The old man was NS himself, as I am sure you know, and he tried to do what he could to restore some sense of honor, dignity, and purpose to National Socialism in this country. but he once described it as trying to paint the Sistine Chapel with a troop of monkeys let loose in the building. To give him his due, Leach and those NS comrades like him went far towards restoring our ferocious don't fuck with a Führer's boys reputation. The world learned to fear us again, as it should. Leach never took prisoners, and he dealt with the local loyalists in what was then called a proactive manner. Proactive as hell. Chainsaws and propane torches, mostly. All those red, white, and blue Masonic dish rags disappeared from the front porches, and that neck of the woods around Ellensburg got real disloyal, real quick, I can assure you. Don paused, almost as if, H. Covington, hesitant to add something. Leach was also in charge of Force 101 during the cleanup. Force 101? Asked Nel. They were responsible for enforcing the offenses against the Race Act, said Redmond. Specifically Article 9. I should be speaking with Leach today. My daughter was asking me about that just last night. The hangman, said Nel bluntly. Yes. They were the troops who executed over 70,000 people in the course of a single year, mostly white people who were proven to a moral certainty to have been sexually involved with blacks or other non-whites. Moral certainty, asked Nel, not legal certainty. What law? There was no time, there were no courts, and hell was loose on earth, sighed Matt. That's why even today we still have people petitioning the party for investigations, trying to clear Grandma or some other relative who danced Danny Deaver from a lamppost when Force 101 came through town. Yeah, there were some mistakes made, and the party has paid some pretty hefty compensation settlements and a lot of scholarships to descendants, but mostly we got it right. Whether they were with us or not, the whole community in the Northwest secretly loathed race mixing. All white people do, deep down. Few were denounced without cause. There was a time when you couldn't go outside in any middling-sized town in the Northwest without seeing a corpse or two dangling from the nearest tree or lamppost. Some white men swinging alongside their Asian or Filipino whores, but mostly it was white women and their beasts of pleasure. Sorry, the very thought of that particular crime makes me want to vomit. That law is still in force, you know. As well it should be from now until such time as the Imperium truly arrives. It all comes out eventually. Some of those wretched women stayed on after Longview, God knows why. Did they think people would just forget? Someone always remembers and eventually someone always tells. Just last week a 59-year-old grandmother was hanged in Pullman. Her own son found some old photos in the family attic his mom had been stupid enough to keep. Photos of her canoodling with her Chinese boyfriend from high school. The man was NS and he denounced his mother. He did absolutely right, and I thank God that I am not he. Nel nodded. That was long before my time, but I understand why such things had to be. There has to be a racial line that no one crosses, not ever, because when you cross it, then everyone loses everything. Maybe if we had been a little more strict on the old Immorality Act under apartheid, I'd still be in Germiston now. Poofters swung as well? No, said Redmond. They pulled up to the gate of the naval base, identified themselves to the sentry, and were directed to an office building about a quarter-mile down on the left. Homosexuality was considered to be so shameful, as indeed it is, that society should not even acknowledge it in death, continued Redmond. It wasn't done in public. The few faggots and dykes that were too stupid to flee when they saw what was coming, they simply became no more. And where possible, every documentary and tangible trace of their very existence was erased. You know, Sergeant, that even today there are no actual laws on the books in the Republic against that perversion? It is classified as a form of mental illness, which it is. It is blasphemy, replied Nel with a frown. Such creatures should be stoned as the Bible says. It is the man or the woman saying, I know better than God who made me how my body should be used. I can overrule God if I want to. Yes, from the biblical viewpoint it is certainly blasphemous, but faggots really are crazy as hell, said Redmond, shaking his head. You've had full medicals. Before. In the army and when you joined the force, right? You've had a prostate examination? Don't remind me, said Nel with a scowl. Yeah, I know. Having things jammed up your ass hurts. But a homosexual actually enjoys that kind of filthy pain and degradation. That's mental illness in my book. On the very rare occasions when we come across it in the Republic, The people involved are quickly certified as insane and confined in a mental institution, where they are either cured through intensive therapy, or if that does not prove possible, then their minds are laser erased and they start over. Believe me, when that happens, in one sense, they're just as dead as if they had been stoned. But stoning would be so much more fun, protested Nell H. Covington. I think you and Bloody Dave will get along fine, chuckled Redmond. He parked the car. We're here. Let's go. The two security cops met with Bloody Davy Leach in the technical wing at the bustling Bremerton Naval Yard. From the window of his office, Don looked out and saw a row of long, lean atomic-powered U-boats in the slips, while another of the gray shapes was cutting through the blue waters of the Sound, heading out on patrol. Admiral Leach was a brawny, scowling man in his 60s, with a grizzled sailor's beard of reddish-white. One could easily imagine Leach standing behind the wheel of a clipper ship braving a nor'easter or rounding the Horn, and maybe ordering the odd keel hauling. The chest of his blue Kriegsmarine uniform gleamed with a dozen decorations. He was in his office poring over the plans for the floating fortress NRS Bismarck. The plasma weapons are the big thing, he explained, rolling up the blueprints. Since the First World War, no navy on Earth has ever really been able to find a counter to the submersible, or a viable defense against air attack, other than surrounding the vessel with a screen of other aircraft. Surface ships have been reduced either to carriers, missile-launching platforms, or transports. We're working on an integrated, computerized particle beam interception system that will knock out any torpedo or missile fired from below and bring down anything in the air, up to and including satellites and space stations. In a few years, gentlemen, the Kriegsmarine will sail the oceans of the world as the only seaborne military force since 1914, with a reasonable expectation of immunity from underwater attack or aerial assault. The other world powers will eventually develop similar systems. Who knows? Combined with a plasma particle beam air defense weapon system, we could be seeing the rebirth of the battleship as an effective weapon of war. That also means that we can effectively move division-sized troop contingents overseas without having to rely on costly and vulnerable air transport. The old 20th century idea was that air power alone would do it all. The Americans had a string of squalid little victories against greatly undermatched opponents toward the end of the century, through mass bombing, and that seemed to confirm the theory. Well, since the invention of the particle beam, air power is broken and sea power is coming back into its own. Leach gestured towards a sofa against one wall. The two bossmen sat down while he leaned against one of the draftsmen's tables. Now, what did you want to talk to me about? Found a spy here? The old man grinned. You won't have to work him over. Just threaten to leave him in a room alone with me for 5 minutes, and he'll tell you anything you want to know. I ain't done a man in nice and slow in a long time. I'd like to talk about the Olympic flying column, said Don bluntly. I'd like to talk about Ravenhill Ranch. I'd like to talk about why you weren't there when Murdoch and the rest of them got it. Why wasn't I with the column? Snarled Leach. I'll tell you why. I wasn't there because Tom Murdoch put me on babysitting duty with Holy Joe Cord at the aid station, the same man who invented these plasma weapons that have made our survival as a nation possible, so I'm glad I didn't strangle him with my own 2 hands. As often as I was tempted to do so, Commandant Murdoch ordered me to secure the temporary medic position in Polsbo to take care of any wounded we might have after the attack in Port Orchard. Trudy Greiner was supposed to be there as well, driving one of our vans. She was to act as a nurse if necessary, and also to provide onward transportation for any of the wounded. She never showed up, and later we found out why. You believe Trudy Greiner didn't arrive at the aid station because she was the informer who betrayed the column? Asked Redmond. You don't know your history very well, do you, son? Snapped Leach. Where the hell have you been for the past 30 years? Yes, that's why the bitch didn't show up. She had $1 million burning a hole in her pocket, and she had other things to do. You know where I was when my brothers and sisters and comrades died, Colonel? I was listening to Holy Joe babble on about the saving grace of Jesus fucking Christ while we laid out scalpels, latex surgical gloves and IVs, and catgut to sew people up and morphine syringes to stop them from screaming, while we tried to save their lives in the back storeroom of a goddamned burger boy. We had a little portable TV, we had it on CNN, and in the cheery light of first morning we, H. Covington, heard that they were all dead. We packed up our gear, I got into my car and Cord got into his, and we ran like hell. We were so upset we didn't even take any of those cute little packets of ketchup they used to give out at those joints. Now why the hell are you asking me this after all these years? I don't think this Joppy kid was even born then. Some rather serious questions have arisen regarding the events of that time, Admiral, said Redmond evenly. What questions? Demanded Leach Admiral. I have been ordered by the state president to find out exactly what happened at Ravenhill Ranch and why, said Redmond. I am sorry to take up your time, but I intend to do just that. To find out what happened. If you do, will you do me a favor and tell me? Said Leach, suddenly seeming to shrink, turning his head away. That business about Trudy Greiner. It just never seemed right to me, Redmond. Not right in what way, sir? I just never could understand how she could do what they said she did. Damn it all, I just never figured her for a rat. He cried out, a lifetime of agony and frustration in his voice. I'd give anything if what, sir? Asked Redmond. If I could die knowing she didn't betray us, sighed Leach. I was somewhat in love with her. I have always had this idea in my mind that the whole story never came out there. It was something I wanted to believe, you understand. It just didn't seem right to me. Then maybe it's time it was made right, suggested Redmond. You may even get to ask her about it yourself. What? Demanded Leach, astounded. She's coming home, said Redmond. On October 22nd, Independence Day. Trudy Greiner is going to walk across the border crossing at Mountain Gate, or so she tells us. Well, I'll be... What exactly do you want to know? Asked Leach keenly. We'd like to get some background first, said Redmond. We'd like to know how you got involved in white racial nationalist activity in the first place, how you ended up in the NVA. Just take it from the top. Grew up in Pensacola, and from the time I was a boy I always wanted to go to sea, recounted Leach. My father was a retired full commander in the United States Navy. For him the only three real things, the only absolutes in the whole universe were God, my mother, and the Navy, not necessarily in that order. He had me clawing canvas and tying sheepshanks and double hitches on our boat when I was 5. I joined at 17, and after basic at the Great Lakes Training Center I was assigned to the missile frigate Higbee in the Persian Gulf. Every now and then we used to pop off a cruise or two at Tehran or Riyadh, whoever we were told to hit by whichever Bush or Clinton or other empty suit was in Oval Office at the time. We didn't care. We were the living spearheads of the great American petroleum empire, and proud of it. We kept hoping for orders to nuke Mecca and really rattle the raghead's cage. Ironic, isn't it? I might have ended up as one of the Republic's worst enemies if the bastards had just had the sense enough to leave me the hell alone. Afterward, I spent the rest of my life endeavoring to demonstrate to the government of the United States that they'd fucked with the wrong man. Think I've made my point? I think they're beginning to get a glimmer, Admiral, replied Redmond with a smile. How exactly did they fuck with you? That's not just an official question, it's personal with me as well. Every man of your generation has his story. I'm always fascinated to hear those stories. What happened? Yeah, you're right, agreed Leach. Every man of my generation has his story, some incident that turned him from an American back into a white man. Okay, since you don't mind spending government time spinning yarns, neither do I. This story is mine. Like I said, we were on patrol the Persian Gulf. Then we got a refitting and R&R order, the kind all sailors love. Off patrol we went and into some exotic port. The exotic port in question for the Higbee was a place called Eilat, a resort town on the Red Sea, in what was then the state of Israel before the original owners took back that particular piece of real estate. May Allah bless and keep them for their immortal courage that shamed us all. I was just turned 19 years old. Young and strong, full of piss and vinegar, and with several months' pay burning a hole in my pocket. Me and some buddies of H. A. Covington. Mine were on shore leave and we were cruising the beach looking to pick up some of those long, lean Jew girls with the tanned legs and the arrogant Levantine faces who lounged there like coiled snakes. We'd all heard what great fucks they were and how willing they were to do their duty for international concord with us American allies. I used to get a chuckle out of that when I was ramrodding Force 101. The one time in my life I myself ever tried to race mix, destiny slapped me down hard, one of life's ironies. We heard a noise, recalled Leach, his eyes starting to wander back into the past. We came across some Israeli police who were underneath a pier beating a little Arab kid. maybe 12 years old. I never did learn why, but they were really working this little guy over, 3 of the bastards. Big burly men with black curly hair and hook noses and blue-shaven chins and bulging muscles. Beating the boy, beating him and beating him, in the head and the face and the ribs with nightsticks, with fists and boots, kicking him in the balls while he rolled on the sand screaming. I didn't speak a word of Arabic, but somehow I understood that the boy was screaming curses at them, not begging for mercy. It was the look in the kid's eyes. That impressed me, more than anything. It was the first time I ever saw anyone stand up to the Jews. I saw a young boy shouting defiance in the face of death, and it moved me to my very soul. Non-white or not, I've always had a hell of a lot of time for Palestinians since then. Yeah, they're brown, but by the living Allah who made them, they are a brave and noble breed. Somehow I knew what I wanted then. I wanted to see that same look in the face of a young white boy. I wanted to see a young man of my own race display that kind of courage. My buddies tried to pull me away, told me not to interfere, it was the Jews' country and none of our business. Sorry, man, but when 3 thugs are beating a child to death, no matter where I am and no matter what his race, that's my business. I was a pretty hefty dude in my younger days and I waded into them. Racked 'em, jacked 'em, and knocked their kosher asses into eclipse. That's when I learned that whenever they're faced with any real opposition, and they don't have overwhelming odds on their sides, Jews are cowards. The much-vaunted Israelis weren't anywhere near as tough as they were cracked up to be, not when they came up against a single man who wasn't afraid of them. There were 3 of them, big mean men, and if they'd had any real spirit at all, they would have kicked my ass bad, but I kicked theirs. I got a nightstick away from one of them, and I laid all 3 of those filthy kikes out on the sand, streaming blood from their goddamned hose noses and bawling like babies. The Palestinian kid ran off. No idea whatever became of him. Well, when I got back to the ship that night, all hell broke loose. Needless to say, I was immediately ratted out by one of my own so-called buddies. Back in those days, white men used to inform on one another to zog so quick it would make your head spin. No racial pride at all, no sense of honor or integrity or self-esteem. The Marines were waiting for me. They placed me under arrest, and from then on my life was one long nightmare. I had one stroke of luck, in that once my captain had heard my side of the story and the Israelis' side, he refused to hand me over to them, and he even refused an order from the Pentagon to do so. That was before the diversity law went into effect. A couple of years later, there were no more white male captains, just white male execs to actually sail the vessel, and I wouldn't have stood a chance. Captain Barlow was a real sailor, though, and he stood up for me as far as he could. He kept me from being lynched. If I'd been turned over to Israel, I wouldn't be standing here today. But Barlow had no choice. He threw me in the brig, and I was court-martialed for hate crime and manifestation of bigotry, as it was called in the Uniform Code of Military Justice back then. In my case, it was more serious than usual, because the bigotry I allegedly manifested was anti-Semitism, and that was always worse than any other, except maybe saying nigger. I was dishonorably discharged from the U.S. Navy, to my father's bewilderment and disgrace, and I did a year in the brig in Portsmouth. After I got out, my father disowned me. He never cared what the circumstances were. All he could see was that big glaring D&D. The United States Navy was always right. Period. End of story. I tried to get a merchant seaman's card. Hell, I would have sailed on a Liberian tramp steamer if I could just have gone back to sea, but it was no soap. I couldn't get a berth on a garbage scow on the Hudson River with that D&D and anti-Semite on my record. Couldn't get any job at all except flipping burgers or pushing broom. So I figured if H. Covington was going to do the time, I might as well do the crime. I decided to become a frigging anti-Semite. I went to the library and I started reading about the Jews. There were computers in the public library in Pensacola, and in those days there were still a few websites available that told the truth, operating on servers out of Singapore and such. I was able to read Henry Ford's The International Jew online. I was also able to find a site that had Commander Rockwell's White Power on it. If the library had caught me printing it, I would have been arrested for hate crime. So I sent it chapter by chapter to a printer at a private mailbox service run by Chinese. They either couldn't read it or else didn't they give a damn so long as my money was good. I stopped by after work and paid out most of my salary from the day labor agency for those precious printed pages. I read that book over and over and over again, and I became a National Socialist. To this day I collect copies of White Power. At home I've got over 100 editions in 12 languages. From that day to this, I have never wavered in my knowledge that Hitler was right, and that just about every evil on earth today stems from our rejection of the man from Germany and his message to all of us. All of a sudden I understood why the world was the way it was. And then one day, by accident, I came across a website that had some of the old man's stuff on Northwest migration. It made sense to me, this idea that all of us who knew about the Jews should band together to grab at least a little piece of the pie back from them. I worked the day labor agencies in Pensacola and St. Pete for a year or so until I saved up a few bucks, and then I took the bus to Seattle. I took any job I could on the water, on the piers, and I eventually made a contact who hooked me up with the NVA. Where you acquired the nickname of Bloody Dave, remarked Redmond. Yeah, I was the guy my commandant of the moment called on when there was some really nasty wet work to be done, growled Leach. I was mad, Redmond. I admit it. Mad in the British sense, raving insane, mad and mean at what had been done to me by the United States. I lived on rage and hatred. I grew up on stories of John Paul Jones and Perry and Farragut, Midway and the Coral Sea. I wanted nothing more in the world than to sail the seas wearing the same uniform my father wore, and then they did that to me, all. Because I wouldn't stand by and see a child beaten to death by cowards. It's really weird they charged me with hate crime, because it was that year in the brig that gave me hate, Redmond. A hate that it took me years to get under control. Sometimes it gets to me even now. Like when you were in command of the Spokane and you shelled Wellington, New Zealand to get 7 of your men back? Asked Redmond dryly. They laid hands on my boys, said Leach quietly. I, of all people, know what it means to be in that situation. Barlow could only go so far for me, but when a man is under my command, I go all the way for him. Nobody lays hands on my boys, not ever. He grinned. Well, nobody except me anyways. After Ravenhill you went east, I believe, asked Don. In fact, I am told you went east contrary to orders from the party. They told you to report to Commandant M.C. Lean in Medford, yet your records indicate that you spent the rest of the war with the Hayden Lake Flying Column until you were given your command at Ellensburg. You mean, did I ride with O.C. Ogilvy? Laughed Leach. Damn straight I did. I mean rode with him, literally. We used to move around on chopped Harleys and armored assault vehicles like Mad Max the Road Warrior, like Genghis fucking Khan. Vikings on wheels. Closest thing I could find to sailing on land. We had an armored 18-wheeler we called Big Mama, with everything on board up to 20 mil cannons. None of that escape and evasion shit for OC, no sir. We didn't escape and evade Zog. Zog tried to escape and evade us. We went after everything we could find wearing a United States uniform. We hit and we hit and we hit, said Leach, punching his fist into his palm for emphasis. And when we got the bastards down, we kicked them and kicked them and kicked them. Then we poured gasoline on them and set them on fire, watched them burn and roll and scream. They sent helicopter gunships after us, and we opened up with Big Mama and we shredded them into confetti, metal and flesh and blood drifting down on us like snow. We brought others down with laser-sighted, firing armor-piercing bullets we made ourselves. They sent tanks, and we dug holes and buried nitrate fertilizer bombs and blew those tanks 50 feet into the air. H. Covington. They sent the Rangers, and we charged them like madmen and got in close and whipped them down into jelly. I remember a guy named Tiny Knowlton. Dumb as a bag of hammers, but 6'10" and all muscle. Tiny didn't even carry a rifle. He had a red all-metal fire axe he found at one of the forest ranger stations out in the woods. He decorated it with leather grips and wrote weird stuff on it, kissed it and slept with it. He named that axe, you know. Yes, sir, said Redmond. As a matter of fact, I do know. He named it What Goes Around Comes Around. Something to do with his time in Soledad prison, I don't recall exactly, if even we ever knew. What Goes Around Comes Around now hangs in the Hall of Heroes in Olympia, alongside Comrade Walter Knowlton's 2 iron crosses. And so it should. Funny, you know. I could never get used to referring to him as Walter. Tiny was so strong he could bust open a Bakelite helmet with a single blow like it was a watermelon. The best times were when we dealt with the Loyalists, those pieces of shit who dared to put an American flag on their porch or open their filthy yaps against us. Some fucking red, white, and blue asshole out in some little town in Idaho ran his mouth about evil racism, and we heard about it. OC and the boys would roll in with Born to Be Wild blaring on our speakers. And believe me, we never had any trouble out of those places again. Because in most cases they don't even exist. We burned them to the ground, and if we could find salt, we sowed it into the ground as a kind of ritual so nothing ever would grow there again. You were on about my moniker of Bloody Dave? That was where I got it, and I earned it. Yes, sir, so I've heard. Getting back to Ravenhill, you were at the meeting which took place at the Hoodsport safe house the night before the planned attack on the Special Criminal Court in Port Orchard? That's right, although not all of it, Leach told them. Me and a number of the other guys, pretty much the whole column, was there, out in the woods behind the house and watching the road coming and going, weapons ready. I remember hearing Murdoch mention he wasn't too comfortable having all our people in one spot like that, but it was necessary. Why necessary, did he say? Asked Redmond. Not in my hearing. It wasn't usual, though. The column usually moved in on a target in at least 2 groups, more often 3. Murdoch would command one section, and Melanie Young or one of the sergeants would command the others. But when the Wit Commando was ambushed at Ravenhill, it was almost all of you except for a few who were detached for separate duties, pointed out Nel. For example, we know that only 4 volunteers were sent to collect and bring in the lorry with the homemade mortar tubes on it. That seems an odd level of exposure for so important a weapon. Do you have any idea why that might have been, Mynheer? Not a clue, said Leach in a sour voice, shaking his head. I wasn't an officer of any kind at that time, just a grunt volunteer. I did what I was told. I was called into the conference in the living room of the safe house by Commandant Murdoch to get my assignment. Oh, it must have been about 1 in the morning. I didn't say much, nothing to say really. Cord and Trudy Greiner were already there, and we had a few words about aid station procedure. Nothing unusual. The 2 of them gave Commandant Murdoch a rundown of the available medical supplies we had on hand, what vehicles they said they'd be using, so forth and so on. Greiner told Cord and the Commandant she'd be at the aid station at 7 sharp. She said she'd let herself into the storeroom. Apparently at some point before I came in, she had been given a set of keys to the burger boy. The manager was one of us, like I said. Meet you there? She wasn't going to accompany volunteer Cord and you to the station? Asked Redmond keenly. That's what I just said, isn't it? Growled Leach. Any idea where she was going, why she separated from the rest of the column? None, Leach replied. I always assumed that she wangled some assignment from Murdoch to give her an excuse to cut out on us and get away and then rat us out, but whatever it was, nothing was said in my presence. Like I told you, I was just an AB in those days. They told me to stick with Cord and make sure he and Greiner were able to do what they could for any wounded that showed up without any interruption. If Fatty came down on us, I did the shooting while they did the packing up and running, if they could. Hey, they were. H. Covington. Both more valuable ratings in the crew than I was, and I understood that I was more expendable. It didn't bother me. I got my orders, then I left to rack in for a few hours in a bedroll out back in the woods before me and Joe Cord moved out in separate vehicles for Polsbo on our part of the mission. He followed me. That was the last time I saw the Greiner woman, when I left that house at 1:30 or so in the morning. We had been reliably informed that the Fat Po Commander Coleman got the call from the informant at a little after 2 a.m., said Redmond thoughtfully, drumming his fingers on his knee. You didn't see Trudy Greiner leave? No, I did not, said Leach. You said Trudy Greiner was supposed to be driving one of the NVA vans as a makeshift ambulance. Was she given the van then? Well, like I said, I didn't see her go, but I did see her arrive. In a car. Seems to me it was a Toyota or some Japanese car. Why? Asked Leach. No real reason, sighed Redmond. I'm just trawling through the waters of the past, Admiral, trying to see what comes up in my net. For example, I would like to learn whether or not it was common knowledge that Tom Murdoch was an Odinist, a follower of the old gods of Norse mythology as many of our fellow citizens in the Republic are. Did you know this? And if so, did this create any friction? News to me, said Leach, to all appearances genuinely surprised. Not that I ever gave a damn. I always thought this whole religion thing was a canard, a distraction. That's what always bugged me about people like Joe Cord, and what bugs me about people like that even today. Religion isn't important. Race is important. Not to knock our Christian comrades, and I know that the Christian identity people are some of our best citizens, not to mention our best soldiers, always were. God knows I've commanded enough of them, but I've always had this little bugbear in the back of my mind about Christianity. There's Jesus and then there's Jesus. I've always had this suspicion that if and when the chips come down, Christians will choose Jesus over their race. You remember what the old man said about it? Yes, I remember, said Redmond, although actually it was Commander Rockwell who said it originally. Christianity has one great weakness, and that is that it is a community of faith rather than of blood, and a Christian may be tempted to choose a monkoid who believes in Jesus over a white man who doesn't. Which defect the Christian identity faith answers quite neatly, in my opinion. Does any of this sound to you like she didn't do it? Demanded Leach. Admiral, I'm not sure that at this remove in time it's going to be possible to determine just what the hell happened, sighed Redmond. There is something else I need to ask you about. Statistically, something like 20% of the volunteers of the NVA were female, and every NVA unit or cell had its relationships, ranging from Christian marriages to outright gangbang promiscuity, and everything in between. It has been suggested to us that Trudy Greiner was involved with Tom Murdoch before he and Melanie Young became an item, so to speak. Yes, she was, agreed Leach. It wasn't something anybody ever got up and announced over the campfire, but you usually had a pretty good idea which female comrades were giving it to whom.
You're wearing the ribbon, you ought to know.
I was a bit young to pick up on such things, said Redmond. Yeah, Murdoch broke it off with Trudy when he and Mel started getting it on. You're not the first to suggest that might have been part of Trudy's motive in doing what she did. Was there ever any open bad blood or emotional tension between the three of them? Any obvious lovers triangle type aggro? Asked Redmond. Not that I recall. Not that I saw or heard, replied Leach judiciously, absently scratching his bearded chin. But I repeat, Colonel, at that time I was just a lowly gunner's mate. I wasn't too often in a position to see or hear things like that. Sorry, that's all I can tell you. Thank you, sir, said Redmond. He rose to go, and Nel stood up with him. You have been very helpful. Why do all the older people in the Republic swear like that? Asked Nel with a scowl as they left the building. H.A. Covington. Most of them don't even notice they're doing it. They grew up around niggers, and a lot of niggerism rubbed off on them. 50 years ago, that was the American dialect. You'll get 80-year-old NVA vets who call one another dude and dog and ask what's up. The older people who grew up in the United States are a lot raunchier about sex as well. We're probably the only nation on earth where grandmothers shock and scandalize their granddaughters at the dinner table. I think that's one of the reasons the Ministry of Culture is trying to get everybody back into Victorian days dress-wise. Hopefully the old mores will revive along with Piccadilly weepers and high lace necklines. Sounds like this Ogilvy was a bit of a nutter, remarked Nel. Yes, but he was our nutter, agreed Redmond. As much as I despise Ogilvy and that part of our past, I have to admit that we owe the son of a bitch a lot. You know that right after Longview, before Ogilvy was killed, a dissident faction of the feds refused to release the old man from Florence Federal Prison in Colorado. John Corbett and Pat Brennan got on the horn to the Colorado military governor. They told him they were sending a plane down, and it had damned well better come back to Olympia with the old man on board, because if it didn't, the next guy they sent down to collect him would be O.C. Ogilvy. They handed the old man over when our people pulled up to the prison gate. Who's next on our list? Asked Nel. One of the good things about working for Boss is you get to meet all kinds of interesting people. Ever rousted a cabinet minister before, Hennie? Frank Palmieri. Let's grab a bite of lunch and back down to Ole to the Ministry of Transport. Redmond and Nel were expected at the ministry offices on 5th Street, and they were shown up to the sanctum sanctorum of the department on the 3rd floor. Transportation Minister Frank Palmieri was a stocky, jocose man in a simple shirt and cravat, with a fringe of white hair around his balding head, muscular white hairy arms, and a generous paunch. He looked like an avuncular grandfather. He shook their hands warmly. Always glad to cooperate with Boss, said the technocrat. Have a seat, gentlemen. It is an honor to meet you. Minister, your accomplishments for the Republic are well known, said Redmond. Not just mine, Colonel. They are the accomplishments of an entire nation that refuses to be beaten down, said Palmieri proudly and sincerely. For over a generation, the Americans and the whole damned outside world besides have tried to strangle us. A year after the Longview Treaty, Chelsea Clinton boasted that in another year, all us evil old racists would be eating tree bark and walking or riding in ox wagons. They'd clamp the sanctions down so tight. Instead, we have perfected the alcohol engine, the electric engine, and for heavy work, the methane engine. Haven't imported a drop of oil into the Northwest American Republic for a decade now. No need to. We run our whole economy on pig shit. In spite of every economic sanction the Americans and the rest of the world have imposed on us, we now have the greatest public transportation system in the world. Every town in the Republic over 40,000 people has a light rail system of some description for 5 pence a ride. And in every major city there are subways, tramcars, and crosstown copter shuttle. Our highways are solid and capacious, while traffic jams are a thing of the past. If you don't feel like flying over it in an air car, you can drive down old I-5 in an electric vehicle at 90 miles an hour with your car on cruise control and autopilot. Sit back and conduct a conversation with a passenger in the car in the next lane beside you, without raising your voice. We get delegations of engineers and urban planners every year who come to study the Seattle and Portland and Boise subways. Of course, it helps when white people can ride public transportation without being robbed, raped, and murdered by mud-colored criminals, pointed out Redmond. Yes, that was always the biggest problem with public transportation in the States back in the old days. The Americans solved that problem after the Revolution by forcibly relocating most of their rural white population into the metroplexes, outlawing almost all private automobiles, and forcing people onto overcrowded petroleum-burning trains and buses like cattle. I always considered that a feather in our cap, that we were able to get white people to give up their cars on most occasions and ride on buses and trains and planes and copters. H. Covington and packet boats, voluntarily and enthusiastically. The Americans had to use force. The environmental damage done by concentrated petroleum exhaust fumes was known as early as the 1950s, yet white people clung to their pollution-spewing automobiles because they were terrified to set foot on a bus. That, and the idiots destroyed their own railroad system at the behest of the big oil conglomerates who wanted all those monstrous diesel-burning semis on the roads. Our own railroads carry over 90% of the freight in the Republic. No more of those 18-wheel behemoths that have destroyed every highway in the United States. Northwest Air Service has hundreds of flights every day, and we haven't had a fatality in 21 years now. You name me 2 places, a beginning and an end. Anywhere from a single apartment in Seattle to the most remote mountain reaches of Wyoming. Give me a few minutes on my comm, and I will quote you a fare that within 12 hours max will put you within 100 feet of that destination. Okay, maybe a few hundred feet where Wyoming is concerned. Is that a Wyoming joke, Mr. Secretary? Asked Redmond tiredly. Hardly, said Palmieri with a grin, seeing as how I'm from Wyoming myself. I grew up as the only Italian kid in that godforsaken place called Laramie. I'm sorry, sir, and no, that wasn't a Wyoming joke. Wyoming is one of the most beautiful parts of our homeland, and I would like to point out that I and family take our vacation there regularly. Palmieri laughed. So some of your best friends are from Wyoming? Look, Colonel, don't sweat it. Every country on earth has its own little internal minorities they make jokes about. Kerrymen among the Irish, Georgians among the Russians, whatever. That's Jake with us. That big sky we live under back home more than makes up for any unkindness from our fellow white folks. We know we got something they ain't got, and it's worth a few jokes. If my job didn't keep me here, I'd be back in Jackson Hole tomorrow. Now what can I do for you? Sir, Sergeant Nel and I are conducting a rather strange investigation, and I am going to have to go about this in a rather roundabout way. Please bear with me, this may take some time. Sure, said Palmieri, puzzled. This has to do with things that occurred many years ago. Before we get into that, I'd like to get some personal background, please, Minister, said Redmond. Background on yourself. How you got involved with the revolution. This isn't just official. I have to admit that this is a hobby of mine, learning how the men and women of your generation actually made the decision to live for something other than their own personal lusts and desires. Jesus, where can I start? Asked Palmieri, puzzled yet willing. Why not start at the beginning? Asked Redmond. All the way back to the beginning. All right. My dad was born in New York. He left high school when his own dad, my grandfather, dropped dead of a heart attack while laying carpet in some rich Jew's condo. My pop was a working man all his life, the ultimate blue-collar patriarch. Big man with short black hair and a beer belly, but over that belly were equally bulging chest and arm muscles. He had no engineering degree, But when it came to building roads and bridges, Sal Palmieri told the engineers how it was done. He came out to Wyoming with a highway contractor on a summer job that was supposed to last 3 months. He thought it was the total pits. Then he met a girl named Gina Yates, my mom. All of a sudden, Wyoming was the only place on earth he ever wanted to be. Dad settled down in Laramie. He was a federal employee, ironically enough, although that didn't save us from It Takes a Village when the time came. Mom was a born-again fundamentalist, and Dad converted to her church and got baptized before she'd marry him. Officially, anyway. He told me once when I was a kid that he didn't believe a damned word of it, and despite that he'd never regretted a day his life with my mother. Dad just kind of went along with church and Jesus and all, but Mom was a dyed-in-the-wool believer. I don't mean one of the crabby tub-thumping types. My mother was one of the kind of born-againers who honestly believed that God is love and Jesus wanted everyone to be joyful. We had a big family. I was the second of 8. I didn't realize it then, but that already marked us as suspicious in the eyes of the authorities. White couples weren't supposed to have a lot of white babies. They were supposed to adopt orphaned gooks from Korea or whatever. Large families of white kids. H. Covington indicated that someone wasn't getting with the program. Fundamentalists are supposed to be big on the spare the rod and spoil the child thing, but it wasn't like that. Neither Mom nor Dad ever raised a hand against any of us. They didn't have to. None of us would have so much as thought about crossing Dad. Believe me, that didn't happen. If one of us kids was in a bad mood and giving Mom problems, the rest of us would pile on the offender and straighten him or her out toot sweet. I had a great childhood for a while there. What happened? Asked Redmond. Hate crime happened, recalled Palmieri grimly. What else in those days? I was 10 years old when Federal Child Protective Services came for me and for my brothers and sisters. You know that they created a whole federal agency, complete with SWAT teams, whose purpose was to take white children out of what they termed unsuitable homes. They called it the It Takes a Village program after a book that vile bitch Hillary Clinton wrote. Yes, I know. Oddly enough, I was reviewing that bit of our history with my daughter just the other evening, said Redmond. I almost was taken myself when I was 6. My uncle and aunt had to more or less smuggle me home to the Northwest. Yeah, well, make sure your girl learns that chapter in her history book real good, said Palmieri bitterly. My family was one of their first victims. It was just like the 10/22 situation with the singers, but Laramie wasn't Coeur d'Alene. Our neighbors just stood by cowering and watched while it happened. So much for the cowboy heritage. One of those neighbors was a typical village busybody woman. She turned my mother in for the reward. She called the Federal Child Protective Services and reported my mom for teaching us hate and giving us homophobic literature to read. I made damn sure the hunters tracked the old bag down later. They finally found her in an old folks' home in Cincinnati 18 years ago and cut her throat. They sent me a photo. I went back to Laramie for the first time since it happened, and I buried that photo between the headstones of my mother and father. I go back every year since then, but never before that. I couldn't go to my parents' grave empty-handed. You're not Italian, so you wouldn't understand that. My aunt is Tori Stapaglia, and I am a longtime personal friend of Major General William Vitale, so yes, Minister, I would. Understand that. What was the homophobic literature your mother allegedly gave you? Asked Redmond. Mom was teaching us in our little Sunday school from a King James Bible, said Palmieri. I didn't know then, but I've made it a point to learn some history, and there were some federal court rulings to the effect that the King James Version contained homophobia, the book of Leviticus and all. You know how they were in those days. All the ways those bastards in Washington took away the freedom of white people in general, and Christians in particular. They created situations where you could exist, but you couldn't function. The true scripture wasn't legally banned, oh no, can't do that under the First Amendment. But if you used a King James instead of what they called the inclusive version of the scripture, you could be sued in civil court, which was immune from what little was left of constitutional safeguards. Or you could be hauled up in front of a human rights tribunal and you could lose your children to the state based on an administrative decree that bypassed the courts and legal system. Yes, the abuse of civil law was one of their favorite and most destructive weapons, agreed Don. That's one reason why we don't have any civil law or lawyers in the Republic, just community arbitrators, drawn from citizens over the age of 50, who arbitrate disputes on the basis of common sense. Palmieri nodded wearily. A bit too late for my brothers and sisters and me. Of course, what it really was in practice was a gigantic child kidnapping ring, snatching children from white working-class families or religious homes, and giving them to families of rich liberal elitists who couldn't or wouldn't have children of their own, or even worse, what they called gay couples back in those days. Always white kids, of course. Somehow they never seemed to get around to applying all these wonderful child protection laws to Mexicans or blacks. One night, 30 armed men crept up on our home in the small hours of the morning. They shot our dogs with silenced rifles, and then kicked in the door of our house. My father didn't even know what was happening. He thought we were being attacked by criminals, which we were, of course, but trouble was that the criminals had badges. My father grabbed a pistol from the nightstand and the soldiers of the United States shot him dead. A Covington. I used to dream of monsters when I was a kid, and that night I really did wake up and find a monster beside my bed, a big thing in body armor and a gas mask. It pulled me out of bed and down into hell. They dragged my mother out into the yard, screaming in her nightdress in 20-degree weather. They handcuffed her and threw her into a police car. I only saw her once again, at the formal hearing 3 months later, but they kept her in a kind of glass booth so she couldn't communicate with us and teach us any more hate. The fact that they taught me a hate on that night that has never died probably escapes them to this day. The judge banged his gavel and they took me away, and they took all my brothers and sisters away to different places. After years of searching, I have been able to find my sister Graciela and my brother James and bring them home. The other 5 vanished forever. God knows where they are now, or even if they are alive. I remember my mother's face staring at me through the plexiglass while they were dragging me away from the hearing, and then someone turned out the light in her booth and I never saw her again. A few days later, my court-appointed lawyer came and told me that Mom committed suicide the day after that piece of shit in the black robe took away her legal custody. Then he stood up and closed his briefcase and walked out of the room, and I never saw him again. Poor Mom. She loved everyone, and in return those bastards burned her soul alive. I had it rough, but in a smooth kind of way, if you get my meaning. The federal court system placed me, or I should say they sold me for the so-called adoption bond to a pair of fruits in Seattle who paid $200,000 for me, so at least I got a free ride home. If I'd been sent to Florida or Chicago, it might have turned out different, like it did with most of my brothers and sisters. It was a big luxury condo on Capitol Hill where they took me one day. Most kids would have rebelled outright, but I think maybe my Sicilian peasant heritage came in handy. Somehow I understood that there was a time when one had to bow down to superior authority, smile in their faces, keep quiet, and wait. They have a saying in the old country, you know, about how vengeance is the only dish that tastes best when eaten cold. I knew without doubt that someday I would have my revenge against the evil people and the evil government that murdered my parents. Bruce and Neville were good enough to me the first couple of years, and so I kept my mouth shut and went with the flow. Yes, sir, no, sir. 3 bags full, sir. Frankie has 2 daddies, you get the idea. They bought me bikes and baseball gloves and computer games, and tried to be my pal and all that stuff. Even talked with me some about the Bible like Mom used to. No King James, though. They definitely used the inclusive version. Let me guess, said Redmond. The story of David and Jonathan? Oh yeah, they were real big on that particular chapter and verse, returned Palmieri with a contemptuous sneer. Then one night the inevitable happened. I think the 2 of them drew straws to decide which of them got to break me in, so to speak. Daddy Nev drew the short straw in every sense of the term, for which I imagine Daddy Bruce was thankful afterwards. Daddy Nev came into my bedroom and tried it on. I was 13 by then, big for my age, and I knew more about what was what than they realized I knew. Along with the baseball mitt, they'd given me a Louisville slugger. Bad move on their part. I knocked the fudge-packing motherfucker flat with the first blow, and then while he was lying in a daze, I locked the bedroom door. Then I went to work with the bat. Took my time, nice and slow, aiming every blow so I could hear the faggot scream and feel things break, feel them crunch and rupture through the wood of the bat. All the time I knew how horrified Mom would have been, she who'd loved everybody in Jesus' name and always taught meekness and forgiveness. Part of me felt bad about it, because of Mom, but that night it was my dad's Italian blood that came out in me. I think my forebears in the South Bronx were watching too and cheering me on. Christ, it felt good to finally hit back, to finally hurt back after all those years of helplessness. Neville was screaming. Bruce was pounding on the door screaming. Finally I broke the bat, and then climbed out the window and beat feet. I learned later it took Nev 4 days in the hospital to die. I lived rough on the streets of Seattle for about 3 months, then the cops picked me up in a sweep. I was tried as an adult, of course, and they sent me to Walla Walla, life for the killing and no parole because of the hate thing. Guess who my first cellmate was? Asked Palmieri with a grin. A Northwest settler? Asked Redmond. A Covington. Yeah. Not just any settler either, as great a bunch of guys as they all were. It was Winston Wayne. Ah, co of the Coeur d'Alene Brigade, then commandant of the Sawtooth Flying Column. So you were one of the Walla Walla 43? Asked Redmond in admiration. Yup. The future brigadier and me and 41 other badass white men busted out of the strongest prison west of the Mississippi, and we went into the mountains. Most of us hid out in the Coeur d'Alene area. On the morning of October 22nd, I could actually hear the shooting from Gus Singer's place from the safe house I was in. Wayne told us to stay put while he stuck A in his belt and went out to see what the hell was going on. An hour or so later, Wayne comes in grinning from ear to ear, tosses me a Heckler & Koch submachine gun and says, "Courtesy of the Idaho State Police, young Francesco. The cop I got it off won't be needing it anymore. Gentlemen, lock and load. Let's go make ourselves a homeland. From then on, as they say, it's all in the history books. Look, Redmond, let's cut the crap. You're a senior boss officer and Corby Morgan's son-in-law. You didn't come here just to jaw-jack about the old days. What's going on and how can I help?" "Actually, sir, I really did come to jaw-jack about the old days," said Redmond. "One episode from the old days in particular. It is a fact, is it not, that you're one of the 8 volunteers who survived the last ambush that wiped out the Olympic flying column?" "Only because I wasn't there," said Palmieri dismally. "I wasn't there." The older man was silent for a moment. "Jesus, Redmond, why the hell did you have to bring that up? That was the worst thing that ever happened to me in my life, in a way even worse than what happened to my family. Those guys and gals were my family. It was like losing mom and dad all over again. What could there possibly be for you to investigate after all this time? That evil bitch Trudy Greiner sold us all out for $1 million. Redmond, before God, I have never raised my hand to a woman in my life. That was one of Dad's ironclad rules for his boys, and I have always obeyed him, not even during the war. I never even shot at a female cop or soldier, at least not on purpose. I'd aim away at the last second. If I saw it was a woman, a lot of us would, even with those wretched American bitches. But that's one woman I've dreamed of killing all my life. I wish I had her and that $1 million out at Union Station. I'd fire up a locomotive and throw her into the methane furnace alive and kicking, and the money after her. Minister, please understand this. Something has come up, and I need to know about that time. I don't mean any insult or insinuation, but I have to ask these questions. I need to know where everyone was when the ambush at Ravenhill Ranch went down, and I need to know why they were there. Now, I understand that the original idea was to launch a truck-borne mortar attack on the Zog Special Criminal Court in Port Orchard, with a view towards disabling the facility and killing as many lawyers and other enemy effectives as possible. Yeah, that was the plan. You did not go with the main column, but you drove the flatbed truck with the mortars, asked Redmond. Yes. Me and volunteer Saltovic. You may have heard of Drago, he's a well-known concert pianist now. Yes, Minister, I know. May I ask why you were assigned to that particular detail? I'd helped Joe Cord, Drago, and Sergeant Ron Nolan build and load the homemade mortars, and I knew how to operate the hydraulic elevation press as well as Drago and Ron did. Who actually drove? Asked Redmond. Drago Saltovich was driving. I was on the passenger side in the cab. We left the lumber yard in Hoodsport at 5:30 or thereabouts. The McCandlesses were driving our scout car, a beat-up old Oldsmobile that looked like it was on its last legs, but Ed had souped that thing up to where it could outrun anything Fatty had short of a helicopter. Only 4 people with the mortar truck? Asked Redmond keenly. Wouldn't it have been more usual for Murdoch to divide the column into 2 groups, one his and one commanded by Melanie Young to escort the mortar truck? Yeah, agreed Palmieri. Usually we'd move in on an operational area in 2 or 3 smaller columns, but I think in this case the thinking went that too many vehicles together might draw attention to the mortars. We wanted to look like we were just delivering some PVC pipe to a construction site, and it might look a Covington odd if we had a small convoy of other vehicles with us. The idea was that if we were intercepted, Drago would hit a 2-minute timer that would detonate the mortars on the back of the truck and obliterate anything within 300 yards when she blew. Then, while that was ticking, we'd pile into the back seat of the Olds, and Ed would burn rubber out of there. Ed was a demon driver, and I figured we would have had a better than even chance of getting clear. If we didn't, there were enough weapons and ammo in the car so that we would have taken plenty of those federal pigs with us. "How were you planning on getting to the target area in Port Orchard?" asked Redmond. "We had decided on a kind of roundabout way down into P.O., Palmieri explained. Highway 101 south down to Shelton would have been the obvious way for us to start out, but then 101 was always full of FATPO and Army checkpoints and patrols." "That's because it was always full of NVA as well," chuckled Redmond reminiscently. "The Federals used to call Highway 101 Ambush Alley. Yeah, and we figured we'd better avoid Ambush Alley," replied Palmieri with a nod. "So instead we eased northward along some county roads and firebreak roads, then across 101 real quick just south of Lillivop, where we slid the truck and the Olds onto an old decommissioned ferry boat that some of our people had come up with from somewhere. There was a crew of 3 men on that thing. Never knew their names, never saw them before or since, but it took them maybe 10 minutes by the light of dawn to slip us across that little finger of Hood Canal there and get us up onto land again." "So there may be other surviving NVA volunteers who knew about the mission and participated in it?" asked Nel excitedly. "These 3 men? It won't fly, Hennie," said Redmond, shaking his head. "You think one of the ferry boat guys might have ratted out? But it wasn't the mortar truck that was ambushed. It was the main column." "Sees, ya, Colonel, you're right," agreed Nel in disappointment. "Go on, please, Minister," urged Redmond. "Once the 4 of you in the mortar truck got across Hood Canal, what then?" "From there we moved slowly down the cat roads towards Bremerton," Palmieri continued. "Finally we came out onto Highway 3 going right into Port Orchard. That was about 7:30 in the morning. The attack was scheduled for 9 sharp. Right when all the bastard lawyers would be coming in so we could take out as many suits as possible. We were making good time and we didn't want to get to ground zero too soon and call attention to ourselves. We pulled over into a small diner just outside Port Orchard. So did the MC Canlesses. We got out, locked our vehicles, bought a paper from the vending machine, walked into the Greasy Spoon, sat down and had breakfast just like we were normal citizens." "Christ, how could you eat anything?" asked Nel in wonder. "Michael Collins's first rule for life on the run," said Palmieri with a smile. "Never act like you're on the run." Palmieri's face sagged in sudden terrible memory. The waitress had just brought breakfast to our booth when the television over the counter started blaring the news about the column being wiped out at a place called Ravenhill Ranch just north of Shelton. We saw news helicopter shots of the burning vehicles. The copters got down real low and used telephoto lenses, and we could see the fatties turning over the bodies of our brothers and sisters, kicking them, spitting on them, niggers and Mexicans unzipping their flies and pissing on the faces we knew. We were in shock. There was a man at the counter, I won't ever call him a white man, in working clothes with a big red, white, and blue flag on his baseball cap. He started showing his butt. He was laughing and yelling and cackling about how great it was those racist bastards finally got theirs, and how none of them really came from Washington anyway because everybody knew the old man brought all the horrible racists into the Northwest from around the world. They gave the Northwest a bad name, and Northwest people were really loyal Americans. Oh, Jesus. I wasn't even thinking. Before I knew it, I had my gun out and in my lap below the table, clicking the safety off. I think we all did. Then Britt MC Canless, who in those days was the most incredibly fine chunk of long-haired, long-legged, witchy womanhood you ever saw, leaned over and took me by the wrist. Her hand was tiny, but it was like my wrist was clamped in a vice grip. I couldn't move it. "Not now," she whispered. "We have a mission to complete. Not now, my brother. H. Covington." So we sat there in that booth, our faces calm and blank, and we choked down our omelets and hash browns and toast and took our time finishing our coffee, and none of us vomited in our sheer grief and rage. I think that was the hardest thing I ever had to do during the war. I don't often have nightmares about that time of my life, gentlemen, but when I do, it's never about Walla Walla Prison or combat. It's about that morning in that diner, and I am stuck there in a kind of time warp, stuck there forever, forcing horrible food down my throat with my chest and my brain on fire. exerting every nerve in my soul not to scream and weep and kill, kill, kill. We finally finished. We got up. Britt paid our check at the cash register, just like we were ordinary tourists passing through. We passed the asshole in the American flag baseball cap with a little smile and a nod, and we went outside into the summer morning. The jackass with the American flag cap had another big one on the rear window of his SUV. All four of us memorized the license number as he left. Then we went over by the truck. "Do we have a secondary target?" asked Brittany. That's all she said, nothing else, and it was the absolutely right thing to say, because it reminded us that we were soldiers and we had a job to do, and that the time for grief would come later. May the Earth Mother bless Brittany MC Canless forever for that. Ed says the phone company offices. We take that out, we can make sure about 200,000 phone subscribers lose service for a bit and don't get their bills this month. Dragos says, we should try for a police station, the big one in Bremerton, but I wasn't having any. No, I told them. You saw what they did. You heard them cackling in triumph on TV. You heard that motherfucker wearing the Masonic dish rag on his head. We have to make sure they die today as well, as many of them as possible. We can still take out the courthouse. Dead lawyers. We will give the Commandant and Melanie and all the rest of them the best tribute of all. Dead lawyers. I guess you can see I still hadn't quite gotten over the court system killing my parents and stealing my family and giving me to those faggots. You didn't think of implementing General Order Number 8? Asked Redmond. Escape and evasion? The thought of running away never occurred to us, said Palmieri, shaking his head. Anyway, because we would have no covering fire, we agreed to use the timing detonator and turn that 18-wheeler from a mortar transport into a mere common or garden variety truck bomb. Drago set the timer down to 30 seconds. We drove into Port Orchard and we took out the courthouse. Killed a dozen lawyers, 2 judges, and the blast managed to jam a long shard of glass right up a U.S. attorney's promissory estoppel. Palmieri chuckled at the memory. There were 4 of you when you against at least 40 cops, Fat Pose, and U.S. Marshals, Redmond reminded him. Yet you completed your mission anyway, at extreme risk to your own lives. 4 Iron Crosses and a victory that took the edge off the massacre of the Olympic flying column that morning, recovered the NVA's morale, and gave us another legend to tell our children. I never thought of it that way. It was just something that had to be done. I was usually scared when we went into action, but not that morning, said Palmieri. That morning it wouldn't have mattered if there had been 400 of them. Or 4,000. Don decided to throw a grenade. Did you know Tom Murdoch was an Odinist? Yeah, sure, said Palmieri. We all knew. How did the others feel about that? Asked Redmond. Joseph Cord, for example? Most of us didn't give a flying fornication. Joe, well, everybody called him Holy Joe, and sometimes he got kind of hard to take. He almost got his ass whooped over the campfire on more than one occasion, but Murdoch ran a tight ship. Cord is an asshole, but he has this lifelong ability to make himself absolutely indispensable to the Aryan cause. After a while, out there in the hills, we all got used to one another's eccentricities. War has a way of doing that to men. How about Melanie Young, who is known to have been a devout Christian fundamentalist? Pressed Redmond. Oh, she damn sure didn't mind, chuckled Palmieri. I don't think she would have minded if Tom Murdoch had been a Persian fire worshipper. He loved her and she loved him. We knew that every time we saw them together. Minister, there is something else I need to ask you about, said Redmond. We have heard several stories to the effect that Commandant Murdoch and Volunteer Greiner were personally H. Covington involved, so to speak, before Murdoch began his well-known and historic affair with Melanie Young. Can you shed any light on that? Yeah, it was pretty common knowledge within the column, agreed Palmieri. Murdoch broke it off with Trudy within a week after Mel arrived from Montana. Hell, we were all lining up the minute Mel walked into camp, but Tom jumped right to the head of the line. Rank Cathod's privileges? Asked Nel. Maybe some of that. We all damn near worshipped him and it just seemed right he should have her. There was never a shred of jealousy of any kind. It's kind of hard for me to explain, but that's just how it was. We considered ourselves lucky to have her with us. Melanie had been doing underground work in Helena and Billings, basically spying. At the beginning of the war, she was employed by the Montana State Police as a confidential clerical worker. She was a very fundamentalist, Christian as you said, and she was able to get in really deep and close by spinning them the tale about how Jesus loves the little children. Red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight, all that inclusive version crap. I suppose I shouldn't mock, since my own mom really felt that way. But by convincing them that she was a Judeo-Christian instead of a real Christian, Mel was able to deliver just about every piece of information Montana had on any of our people or operations to the NVA. She was the one who kept Jack Smith of the regulators living as long as he did, from what I hear. Then she transferred to the FATPO as a psychological profiler of all U.S. horrible racists. She knew psychology all right. She was that good at pulling the wool over their eyes. I remember, agreed Redmond with a nod, and I have seen every movie ever made about her, said Nell. Redmond nodded. Yeah, everybody knows her story. After a long run, Melanie felt she was finally suspected, and she E&E'd one jump ahead of them. When she left, she copied every FATPO file she could find for us, dumped a computer virus of her own invention into the Fed's network that wiped out their servers, and left a handbag with 8 pounds of ticking C4 plastic explosive under her desk. She was a hell of a woman, sighed Palmieri in sad recollection. So she has gone down into history, Minister, said Redmond. Did Trudy Greiner resent being replaced in Tom Murdoch's bedroll by that hell of a woman? Trudy was human. I guess she must have, said Palmieri, ruminating. She never showed it, at least nowhere in my presence. So far as I am aware, she never took up with anyone else for the rest of the time she was with the Olympic flying column, although I know she had some of the guys standing in line and taking numbers for the next vacancy, so to speak. Of course, times being what they were, we were always pretty frank and open about that kind of thing. Life was too short to stand on ceremony. And who were these guys who were standing in the Trudy line to take up where Commandant Murdoch left off? Asked Redmond. Me, for one, laughed Palmieri. I got shot down quick. One friendly yet definite pass on my part met with an equally friendly yet definite refusal. Which you accepted? Asked Nell. Oh yeah, you better believe it, Junior. In the first place, a gentleman can always take no for an answer. In the second place, at the best of times, that kind of personal activity was purely recreational, and very much on the side for all of us. We had more urgent items on the agenda, like securing the existence of our people and a future for white children. Our eyes were on the prize. We were fighting a war, and we needed every hand. You didn't want to lose your head over some chick or get her pissed off at you when the next dark night out on Ambush Alley your life might depend on her. Finally, pressing unwanted attentions on a female volunteer was never recommended. They were quite capable of shooting very important parts off a man, finished Palmieri with a grin. Did anyone else have any better success with her? Asked Redmond. I'm not just fishing for old gossip, Minister. This may well be relevant. That was a damn long time ago, but... Palmieri hesitated for a bit. I don't think so. I think Bill Vitale gave her a shot, with the same result as me, and I seem to remember maybe Dave Leach as well. I'll tell you who some of us had our money on in the... H.A. Covington. Trudy stakes, though. Our current state president, the Right Honorable John Corbett Morgan. Oh? Asked Redmond, keeping his voice casual. Why did you think John Corbett was in the running? Did you ever see them together? Well, nothing quite so definite. Sometimes members of the column would meet Trudy on various supply and recon assignments, at safe houses and on fire roads, in motel rooms, warehouses, wherever we had to go to do whatever we had to do. Depended on how hot we were, whether or not we were cool enough to move in among the population without our faces being on every post office wall. Sometimes this involved spending several days with Trude while we were doing whatever it was we were there to do. After a while, some of us noticed that she would get regular visits from that weird character Morgan used as his gopher, even back then. You mean Corey Nash? Asked Redmond, surprised. Yeah, agreed Palmieri. That was him. Nash was nutty as a fruitcake, I always thought. But Morgan trusted him, and we all knew that he spoke with his master's voice, so to speak. Anyway, word got out that Trudy and Nash would disappear for a couple of hours at a time, and somehow I just can't see Trudy Greiner having an affair with Nash, of all people. Hell, I can't see Nash having an affair, period. To this day, I run into him sometimes at Longview House on official occasions, or when I have to meet with the president, and I still think he's non-compos. God knows why Morgan keeps him around. Anyway, we assumed that during these little absences, Volunteer Greiner was meeting Morgan, either for business or pleasure. Redmond stood up, turning over this new information in his mind. I have a question, Mynheer Minister. "Did you ever track down the American who laughed at our dead heroes on the telly?" asked Nel with a scowl. "Oh yeah," said Palmieri, stone-faced. "Made a point of it. Little Rambos, we used to call him. We had his license number, and so we got his home address from a contact at the DMV. A week later, Laughing Boy got a little visit along about sundown. Me, Drago, Bill Vitale, and Bloody Dave Leach. We told Dave what happened, and made sure to bring him along. He would never have forgiven us if we hadn't." "Not the Mixie Canlises or Volunteers Court or Frierson?" asked Redmond. "No," said Palmieri, shaking his head. Frierson had already been ordered south to No. 5 Brigade in Eugene. Cord was an egghead and a weirded-out religious nut who was never suitable for wet work. And the Mixie Canlises, well, they were too good for it. By that I mean they were really, really good folks who fought for the noblest of motives and out of the purest of ideals, and we could see that in them. Not that they were soft. Far from it. When we hit that courthouse in Port Orchard, I'll never forget the two of them. Her with an AK and him with a Ruger Mini 14 cutting the bastards down like a combine cuts down corn while Drago and me smashed that truck through the lobby and set the timer. But for something like this, we decided we didn't want it on their conscience. So we borrowed their Oldsmobile but kinda forgot to ask them along, if you get my drift. We found Laughing Boy at home. The transportation minister went on with grim satisfaction. We conked him in his garage with a lead pipe while he was polishing his goddamned gas-guzzling SUV. We threw him and his red, white, and blue American flag baseball cap into the trunk of the Olds, and then we drove him to the diner. There we lined the cooks and waitresses and customers up against one wall at gunpoint. Then we dragged in Laughing Boy and tied him to a chair. He wasn't laughing at us then, I can tell you. He was blubbering and begging for mercy. I guess watching all those John Wayne movies and Rambo flicks didn't do him any good at all in the courage department. But then, very few of those red, white, and blue buffoons were ever anywhere near John Wayne's or Rambo's when it came down to it. Dave Leach took charge. He explained to the people in the diner who we were, why we were there, and why Laughing Boy was there. How he had giggled and cackled and cheered and talked John Wayne shit while Northwest volunteers had died for their race and their nation. All the while, Drago was in the kitchen deep-frying the asshole's American flag hat in amongst the fish sticks and the chicken nuggets. He brought it over on the end of a broomstick dripping with scalding hot oil, and Dave ordered the son of a bitch tied in the chair. A Covington. To eat it. The son of a bitch started bawling and pleading instead, so Dave took the other end of the broom. I propped the bastard's mouth open with a spoon, and Dave jammed the sizzling hat down his throat, all the way into his stomach. That guy made some really incredible noises, indescribable. The people watching all this were petrified. I could tell by the smell that at least one of them shit in his or her pants. Dave walked back into the kitchen and came out with a pot of bubbling grease from the deep fryer. "Don't worry, I got a new hat for you," he tells the guy, and he upends the hot oil all over him and jams the pot down on his head. Leach lets Laughing Boy shimmy and shake and sing for another minute or so. Then he pulls out his 9 and puts a slug in his red, white, and blue heart. Then he turns to our little audience and says to them, "Folks, the moral to this story is, you never know who's listening. Remember that the next time any of you are tempted to open your filthy red, white, and blue mouths and talk loud about men and women whose shoes you aren't fit to shine. And if any one of you says anything to Zog's dogs about us, you will see us again, and we'll be glad to treat you to dinner, just like we did this asshole." Then we left. So did the two boss men. Well, that's a twist. "You think the Greiner woman was having an affair with the state president?" asked Nel curiously as they got back into their car outside the ministry building. "I have to admit it's a hell of a lot more likely than her having an affair with Corey Nash," admitted Don sourly. "If Palmieri's memory is correct about Trudy going off somewhere with Nash for hours at a time, she had to be meeting Morgan, or at least doing something NVA-related for him. Or personally related?" queried Nel. "He told me not," said Redmond. Nel looked away, too diplomatic to suggest that the President of the Republic might be lying, which Don appreciated. "You don't think that by any chance Nash could be the traitor?" asked Nel after a while. Redmond shrugged his shoulders helplessly. "We don't even know if Nash was around when the Port Orchard operation was underway. And what in God's name would be his motive? He didn't get any $1,000,000, and as strange a person as he is, I can tell you that his loyalty to the revolution is the only thing he's ever had in his life. You don't know Nash. I do for many years, and not only has he not ever so much as looked at a woman to my knowledge, but he wouldn't even take a piss without John Corbett's knowledge and permission. He's kind of like the old family retainers they used to have back in Victorian England. Totally dedicated to John C. always was. Believe me, whatever Nash was doing with Trudy Greiner, he was doing it at the behest of Corby Morgan. So? Asked Nell. That was his duty. So why didn't Morgan tell me about it? Demanded Don angrily. You said Morgan did admit that he knew the Greiner woman, and that Nash sometimes acted as liaison, protested Nell. Yeah, he did. In a very vague and offhand way. Almost as if he knew I'd dig it up and he knew he had to at least mention it, or it would really look funny. But I don't like the way this is beginning to shape up. Let's move on. Next up on our list is former volunteer Lars Frierson. In a few minutes, Redmond had dropped down into an air lane 400 feet above Old Interstate 5 and put the aircar on autopilot. I'll go back to manual for the interchange at Portland. I actually prefer a ground car for going up the Columbia River. Less traffic on the ground nowadays, but we need to save time. Why him next? Asked Nell. The survivors were in 3 places, 2 at the aid station, 4 with the mortar truck, and 2 in the scout car just ahead of the column. We've talked to people who were in the first 2 categories. Now I want to speak to someone who is in the green pickup. It also puts off the necessity for me to grill Bill Vitale, he thought sadly, and the necessity for me to question the President of the Northwest American Republic.